So thank you and welcome, Amelia. I'm so glad that you're here to join us today.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much for that introduction, Jamie. It's so great to see everyone's little names. I hope that you'll turn on your video during the Q&A so I can see what you look like. Because I really miss gathering in person. I sort of wish that I could be with you in Arizona today. So like Jamie said, today I'm going to be speaking to you about my research about emerging emulation practices and encountering software emulation in libraries, archives, and museums in the United States. Before I begin my talk, I want to take a moment and acknowledge the place where I'm zooming to you from. So today I'm in my home office, and it's a few blocks away from the iSchool at the University of Texas. And I would like to take a moment and acknowledge that I'm meeting with each of you from Indigenous lands. So please join me in paying respect to the Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Caddo, Tonkawa, Comanche, Lipan Apache, Alabama Coshada, Kickapoo, Tigua Pueblo, and all American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories here on Turtle Island in Austin, Texas. I also want to acknowledge the land where all of you are, where my hosts are. And so here I'm going to be drawing from a statement that the Knowledge River scholars Alex Soto and Braveheart Sanchez developed in their work at the Arizona State University Libraries. As a guest of your institution, the University of Arizona, let's acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. The University of Arizona's main campus is in Tucson, also traditionally known as Tucson. It's located on the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, namely the Tohono O'odham and the Pascua Yaqui peoples, whose caring and keeping of these lands allows us to be here today. So I know how important it is as members of diverse and inclusive institutions to recognize and acknowledge the peoples and cultures and histories that make up our communities. So thanks for letting me start with those land acknowledgements. I have a message that you can't hear me. Is that right? Can you hear me? That's okay. All right, great. Okay, so let's get started here. Okay, so what is this talk about? In the next hour or so, I want to speak with you about how preservationists, librarians, archivists, curators, and digital stewards are providing access to software and software-dependent information in their collections. But more importantly, I want to talk to you about how emulation is becoming an information service provision. It's becoming a new kind of access point in cultural heritage institutions. I also want to speak a bit about the challenges that we have in researching and observing techniques and technologies that are meant to sort of imitate other software and make this kind of preservation work, which is often hidden, more visible to researchers like us, to other information professionals, and to the patrons and the researchers and the users we serve with access points. So my goal for you as an audience by the end of the day is sort of understand how emulation shapes access points and how those access points can be visible and invisible. And in the power of that framing, those different kinds of contexts really do matter, because digital preservation and software maintenance in particular is kind of a backgrounding technology, and it's a kind of what STS scholars call invisible technician work. And they've kind of observed that at length, so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This research involved interviews, online and in-person participant observation, and fieldwork over 20 months in 2018 and 2020 in the United States. I'm really honored to have one or two names, collaborators here on the call today. My participant observation was supplemented by interviews with information workers at a research library, a university technology lab, an archive of vintage computers, and a museum of technology. Based on this work, I'm trying to develop a theory of digital preservation based on different visions of access and trying to start to build a vocabulary for representing emulation as access to software, but also emulation as a digital preservation practice, and trying to identify issues that preservationists face when representing the temporalities and durability of software as they're providing access to it with emulation. So in this research, I'm trying to explore two questions. How is emulation applied differently across libraries, archives, and museums? It's a pretty small sample, but I'll share with you what I found. And I also want to ask, what can we learn from these new kinds of workflows um, that are being implemented as preservationists begin to access emulated software? Okay, but before I tell you more about the study, I want to just give some background, some more stuff about studying software, and then sort of information maintenance of software, but also a bit about the digital preservation methods of software. So since the 1990s, librarians and archivists and museum professionals have been concerned with digital preservation challenges that software and software-dependent artifacts pose for accessing information. In 2013, the US Library of Congress convened this summit called Preserving EXE to develop a national strategy for addressing software as a cultural, historic, and scientific artifact that is worthy of preserving on its own. And this is the cover of the report. The outcomes of this final report emphasize an increasing understanding that software should be preserved and archived for its own sake. So despite the increasing prevalence of software preservation in information institutions and concerns about the challenges that lots of professionals have, scholarly research, scholars like me have, the attention to software maintenance practices of librarians and archivists in place is very limited, actually. Some notable recent examples are Alex Chasanoff's work, Devin Ray Donaldson's work, and Adam Kreisberg's work. And all of these scholars looked at software curation in support of research data management practices in government, scientific repositories, and university research libraries. But even so, the coordination, so working together in teams, and the social practices of software preservation projects from like beginning to end is often in scholarly research focused on cyber infrastructure, engineering teams, and space missions, because there's a lot of space data. So wherever you're studying software maintenance and preservation for about 20 years now, all the studies say that researchers studying legacy software, that software maintenance is a team sport. It's usually done in loose teams or small groups of teams in hierarchical organizations. So one big question is, how should we study these processes amongst preservationists where maintenance and support of long-term collections access is their primary work's responsibility? It's something that they do day in, day out. So what is being preserved when we save software? What do we mean by that? In the current landscape, there are two competing orientations or goals for understanding what is being preserved when we're preserving software. On the one side is this problem of software as a utility, and on the other is thinking of software as evidence and information, preserving it on its own. For digital preservation techniques where machine-readable digital data needs to be accessed, software is the utility for data migration, updating formats, data migration, and that's a sufficient digital preservation strategy when you're really interested in accessing data. But if software is understood as information or a work or evidence of a form of experience, for example, playing a game or listening to a music score, then preserving that software on its own for its own sake becomes this new digital preservation hurdle. It's both technical and theoretical for information professionals. Early accounts of software emulation from the 90s argued that emulation is really the only reliable way to recreate a digital document's original functionality, look, and feel. And while emulation does capture the functional and performative aspects of the software experience, most digital practitioners agree that sustained support and capacity building are really, really needed in order for us to do it at scale and reliably over and over. Emulation is incredibly resource intensive for information institutions with limited operating budgets, and the breadth of technical expertise that's needed is really high for working professionals. And then user demand for accessing that obsolete software from collections is still actually pretty unproven. So, a recent survey from Ithaca SR on the digital preservation landscape a few years ago that found that while community members have begun to gain a lot of experiential knowledge around emulation for software preservation, moving those techniques from theory to practice is still unfolding. So there still needs to be a lot of work done in addressing sort of challenges and the gaps for our professional knowledge and especially dedicated operational resources from libraries and archives. And even in education, for example, so not very many iSchools teach software emulation in their digital preservation curriculum. So as knowledge infrastructures like libraries and archives and museums are going through this immense transformation and collecting more and more software, they need to begin preserving and curating software and software-dependent information for access in different ways. And developing information and access services that move from software as a utility, format migration, to software as an access experience, or software preserving software for its own sake, is sort of this next frontier that we're at right now. As I said earlier, accessing obsolete and legacy software presents a lot of challenges, technical resources, but also other ones like digital rights management, high cost to tools and services, and then also the professional expertise or the staffing that's needed is a lot for resource-constrained organizations like libraries. So to meet their access goals, information institutions have to start developing new approaches to preserving software, and they also need to start implementing workflows for preserving those software-dependent resources as they meet their institutional mandates to collect and preserve and provide access to reliable information resources. So this is sort of the space where this research is beginning. Before I jump ahead, I just want to have a thought experiment for us all. And I want to encourage everyone in the audience for a moment to think about a software experience, not a utility where you want to access a piece of data or some information in a format, but try to imagine an experience with software that you have had in the past that you would like to experience again. For me, it's the iTunes visualizer on, I think, the iTunes 2 on Mac OS 9. It was the visualizer that I used on my music software in college. Spent a lot of time thinking about life and contemplating existence in my dorm room and looking at this visualizer. And actually to emulate this experience again, a lot of things would have to fit together, including having a bunch of MP3s from that moment in time, having a machine and processing power that can run it, and so on and so forth. So try and just, for a thought experiment, try and think of some software that you'd like to experience again. Okay, so while you're all thinking of some software experience that you'd like to access, let's talk about what an emulator is. Some of us may totally know what an emulator or an emulation is, but it's important that we just talk through what does emulation and emulator actually mean. So emulation practices are computational. They're technical processes that use one system to reproduce the functions and results of another system. So an emulator is intended to sort of faithfully, as much as possible, reproduce the information, experience, or form with hardware or software in combination. I just got one in the mail. I'm testing out some stocking stuffer gifts for Christmas. This is an emulator of Game Boy games. It's $20 and it has 400 Game Boy games on it. It kind of looks like an old Game Boy, but not exactly, okay? So this is an example of a game emulator that's both hardware and software, okay? Some emulators simply aim to recreate a digital document's like look and feel, while other emulators aim to reproduce a complete software environment, replicating the functionality of that system on which a document was created or the dynamic media was accessed. If you've ever used Parallels or Boot Camp to run another operating system, like this picture here, you've used an emulator, an operating system emulator. If you've played a console game in a browser, like a Sega game or a PlayStation game in a browser, you've used a game emulator. Many printer drivers and hardware emulators allow for older machines to leverage new physical features of desktop printers, for example. So we're using emulators a lot, whether we're aware of it or not. And for most people, most lay people, we use them to access many of the ranges of services in our stacks that we do just to do regular office stuff like faxing, scanning, signing, and so on. So in addition to digital documents and scientific research data that may be software dependent, libraries are also interested, or collecting institutions are also interested in other kinds of things to emulate. So not just software titles and older versions of operating systems, but they're interested in software dependent objects like art pieces, like video games that I was discussing earlier, like architectural designs. And they're really trying to figure out how to build that into their research, exhibition, and archival collections. So as a result, preservationists are now trying to think about not only how do they grow their software collections, but how do they provide access like they would with other information services to users, to patrons, to researchers, to the public. And for most institutions, software preservation, like digitization projects, is request and resource driven. Someone comes and says, I need to get access to these AutoCAD drawings, for example. And that might trip a workflow in order to get that software emulated for them. But as these collections increase and these use cases increase, it's necessary for these information institutions to develop new strategies for resourcing time, staff, and infrastructure to provide access to software. So here's an example of a game that is being emulated on a Dell machine, and it's student work from one of the institutions that I visited. So why use emulators in cultural heritage institutions if we're already using them already, and why should they be a specific kind of information service provision? For some information objects, migration to a new format is completely fine. For example, updating newspapers to a big TIFF image makes a lot of sense. We can render a lot of the same evidence in ways that doesn't inhibit primary source research or the accuracy of what you're looking at or reading. But accessing obsolete software or older operating systems may not be possible on some new kinds of machines, new kinds of memory processes, storage architecture limits us, even visual displays. So if you've ever rendered old stuff on a new machine with very high resolution screens, it looks kind of clunky. It can't be rendered correctly. So there's lots of new reasons why we might want to start providing access through emulation. I just want to say also an aside is that emulation has been used for decades in a lot of different hobbyist and fan and professional computing communities where legacy software and obsolete media are still accessed. So hardware hackers, vintage video game fans, sound recording engineers, music producers, all of these kinds of folks have very robust online communities where they talk through and document emulation practices with lots of extensive documentation and pros and cons. But emulation as a service, like as an access provision in a cultural heritage organization, is a little bit different because unlike hobbyists or fan communities, information institutions have these collecting mandates that ensure provenance, accuracy, governance, reliability for researchers and for patrons and for historical posterity. So generating knowledge about implementing reliable emulation processes, even at the very beginnings of these programs, I really think is essential, not only for other information institutions who may want to start emulation programs in the future, but also for historians and information scholars of technology. As these practices become more and more standardized for scholarly and scientific research, we're going to want to know how those workflows got um, sorted, how they came to be. But unlike software development and maintenance of legacy software in modern organizations, software emulation for preservation is not really studied that much in information science, in sociology of science, and STS, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the theoretical framing of the project. For this research, I'm drawing on STS and infrastructure studies perspectives that see software preservation as collaborative work between sets of actors and technologies and standards. So people like Marissa Levitt-Cohn, and Adrian McKenzie, Jean-Christophe Plantin, and Alex Chasanoff's work on curating software-dependent research data. I'm really interested in how these scholars have studied software as technology that moves through time. Understanding software preservation as a collaborative process allows us to examine emulation through workflows among small groups of experts in larger organizations, so to see how they're embedded in bigger institutions. And since software emulation is a collaborative system and it supports lots of complex social interactions with people and things and digital stuff, it's making stuff from the past present. We need a real deep understanding about how different groups of people work together in support of accomplishing this task together. So one way to do that is to study workflows of individuals and teams. And that's sort of what I did in my interviews. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a second. For STS and infrastructure studies scholars, as well as computer supportive cooperative work researchers, examining these administrative and technical workflows means studying the processes of work in place. So actually going to people's offices and following them around. You want to see how the arrangements of people work, how the technology is, how it's laid out in a building, and then following them around on their everyday practices. So working with a particular integrated library system software or a microfiche machine day to day, you want to watch people as they're working with those machines and how they're maintaining them. Since the 1960s, software has really been an instrumental part of science and high technology domains. So it's been an object of study in the social studies of science and in information studies for a very long time, because it's always really interesting to study groups of people developing and standardizing and using and maintaining new kinds of information technologies. A lot of people have also talked about how software is also an epistemic tool for knowing the world. So when we're emulating older software, we're also getting a snapshot into how people saw and knew the world when it was first used. So in studying the development and maintenance and legacies of software, historians of computing and STS scholars have really found that software is durable, it's modular, and it becomes entrenched. Some people ask me to define software too, so I just wanted to say I'm using Adrian McKenzie's definition of software. In his Cutting Code book, he talks about software being a multi-dimensional mutating object, and it allows us to account for all these different moves, malleability, fragility, and the circulation of software, but also the qualities of backgrounding that software takes on. It's often there but hiding, and that backgrounding is really interesting. I also draw on Marissa Levitt-Cohn's conceptual framework of timeliness and form when we want to think about the duration of software. At this point, if you have had a computer since college, you've had software in your day-to-day life for 10, 20, 30 years. And it's worth thinking about how that tool is in the background of how you experience training, expertise, work, group culture, and the like. Cohn did a really cool study of engineers and software developers maintaining a computational infrastructure for this planetary space mission to Saturn. And in her study on the space science software, she really emphasizes that we need to approach software not only in terms of the life cycle of the software, and its runtimes, but also the lifetimes of the people themselves that are using it and maintaining it and creating it. So the varying forms of duration, not only of the tool, but of the people using it over time. And other STS scholars like Sharon Charwick talk about this. These runtime software are also our lifetimes. They're counting and measuring our lives with computational infrastructure. So we're really bound up in these kind of different temporalities. And this forms a kind of entangled assemblage of code and careers and new programming languages and expertise and equipment. So software is a lot of different things. But one really important thing from STS in particular is that software work, people who work with software are often found under this category of invisible technicians who care for knowledge, they care for information management and data archives. So Julian Orr, for example, talking machines, that's a real touchstone for this. So my research is trying to extend this, this STS's engagement with invisible work and trying to look at how preservationists and those librarians and those catalogers and those archivists are themselves these sort of invisible technicians. They're what are called information maintainers. So by focusing on how preservationists are implementing these new workflows for emulation, and how they're envisioning how these access points should be used. I'm really, with this research, trying to build on what other people have written about with information professionals providing long-term access over long periods of time. It's long duration. Okay. Oops. Okay, so this is a data curation workflow from another little project, but I want to draw your attention to it. It's kind of a data flow diagramming model, but there's a big red lightning bolt in the middle. And oftentimes these big preservation workflows are mapped out in this way, and they sort of have a pacing to them, sort of say what happens, what could possibly happen. And they're really interesting artifacts to study people and how they implement these workflows to see if these sorts of maps are actually accurate. So a little bit more about my own background. For the last 8 or 9 years, I've been trying to study long-term preservation infrastructures. So how do these workflows get built? How are they understood by the people who built them? And how are they understood by the people who access the stuff that's being preserved? And one of the ways to really get at that is just to ask people about how the workflow works. And in information institutions, workflows are processes, tactics, and steps that individuals and teams undertake in order to provide access to information in their collections. When they implement new technologies or information services like software emulation, preservation workflows become embedded in larger organizational workflows, such as metadata description, processing archival collections, technical services. And when we examine especially digital preservation workflows as complex social interactions in information institutions, we can sort of begin to observe how these methods become formalized and entrenched in place. And understanding them and knowing them more, unpacking them, taking them apart also allows us to think about them in terms of transparency, accountability, and how to begin to articulate how an organization can support digital preservation services. And just to give you one more thing, and one of the things that I really love about workflows is they often show you these are all the parts that are involved in from beginning to end in emulating or curating a thing. But oftentimes, actually, most workflows hardly ever tell you how long each step takes. So temporality, which we know is durable, there are many temporalities found in this map, is not actually captured in most of these formalized expressions of them. Okay, so that's enough about the background. Let's talk a little bit about this research. So my research project is part of a bigger research project. It was conducted in part with a collaboration of a cohort of digital preservationists participating in a 16-month research study through the Software Preservation Network. And the project examined how teams develop and implement software emulation services in different libraries, archives, and museums. So 6 teams from different North American institutions were selected to participate in this research network project called Fostering Communities of Practice, FCOP for short. And each team would meet twice a month, and they would share their experiences with emulating different emulation projects across each of their sites for the next 2 years. In addition to joining some of these online meetings, I went and did 3 field site visits in the summer of 2019. And I also observed online meetings and cohort activities over the 2 years. So during my field site visits, I observed exhibitions, lab spaces, and reading rooms as part of it. And then, because I wanted to understand the intended users that these preservationists were serving with emulation. And then I spent some time sort of observing how patrons, how researchers and students typically access those collections and how they might encounter preserved software in different ways. And then I also followed around a bunch of site champions at each of the sites and asked them what they did every day. Research participants across the larger network of teams, there are all kinds of information professionals and knowledge workers, but they typically all support access services in libraries, museums, and research centers. So they included archivists, catalogers, docents, public services staff, metadata librarians, catalogers, curators, systems administrators, software developers, and even some university administrators, which was kind of interesting. So here's one participant, and she's got the emulation platform here fired up at her desk, and here it's about to start building an environment. So some of the network teams were testing an emulation platform that had a number of different environments in the platform that you could fire up and test for different kinds of software. Here I am on a site visit. So my primary methods of observation and data collection were semi-structured interviews with a range of preservationists working at 3 different information institutions. One was a large research library. Another was a museum of technology, and then also a vintage computing lab or special archive at another university. And I want to take a moment and say that you can publicly find the names and sites of these places, but because of my human subjects research protocol and because of agreements that I made with interviewees, I have chosen to use anonymous or pseudonymous names as I'm describing these encounters. There are going to be 2 places where you will see the sites of places listed in materials. Okay, so reporting on the 25 field interviews and fieldwork observations from 3 sites took place in 2019. And then in spring 2020, I reported my initial findings and themes for a member check with the larger group for confirmation, for feedback, and to verify these results. And cohort members and research participants in the 6 teams were all different kinds of knowledge workers supporting access services. All the interviewees that I talked to were members of preservation, access, or information technology services support teams at their institutions. Some belonged to many, many organizational teams, while others served or managed a single preservation unit. Formal titles from interviewees included like engineers, software developers, archivists, lab managers, digital curators, and digital preservation managers. And the interviewees is pretty even between male and female respondents. I think my video is going in and out, so I will turn it on again. Okay, hopefully that's okay. All right, great. So in the interviews, I tried to use mapping and diagram exercises to do participatory workflow analysis. And you can see that this image here, it sort of has a decision tree that was provided by one of the participants. And she's drawn a kind of yes or no things that can happen and how a emulation inquiry comes in to the organization. And what's kind of cool about doing participatory workflow analysis is we have these ideal artifacts, and then we have these artifacts that people can create on the fly. So we can ask them to map out their day, and then we can walk through step by step. Or we can look at a formal representation like the digital curation workflow that I showed you earlier and say, okay, this is in an ideal world. What does it actually look like in your day-to-day work? One of the other things that I asked all my site champions before I visited was for them to like set aside some mysteries or fun things for us to look at that would really demonstrate what their emulation problem solving would be like. And so we also got to follow some mysteries. And so I wasn't able to get this video up, but here's an example of us kind of talking through a situation on the visit, okay? And hopefully everyone will be able to hear.
Time on it. And also, it's on Pac-Man Bingo, so I have to solve it.
I know. Well, when are these ghosts gonna come? That's what I want to know. Here they come. Look at them. Look at. Oh wow.
Yeah. See, the arrow keys don't even work.
Can you make a little?
So this is an example of one of like a mystery that we might try and problem solve and talk through and ask how it fits into an everyday either workflow or responsibility of the interviewee. So that was kind of fun. Maybe we can hear more about that a little bit later. So I visited 3 sites on my field trips. One was a museum of technology. They primarily use emulation for preservation and maintenance of vintage computing machines and hardware. They have a lot of robust workflows for using emulation in their exhibition displays in particular. And they also tested the emulation platform a little bit for vintage hardware as part of the larger network project. And my site champion, who I followed around, their title is Software Preservation Lab Manager. Another site that I visited was a big university research library and kind of focused in their special collections, which they called a preservation and bibliography unit, if I'm not mistaken. And their network or cohort project was to test out new ways of describing emulation and then to user test some emulation for archival access. So I got to user test some of these archival research workflows. So how would you provide access to an emulated environment to a historian, for example, who's doing primary source research at your special collections? My site champion there was a digital preservation librarian. And then the third place that I went was a vintage computing lab, is what they called it, called RetroTech. And the mandate of this sort of digital hands-on media lab was to engage with their campus community. And the university is a engineering and technology campus, so there's a lot of coders on campus, and that'll come up a little bit later. They wanted to, in the larger network project, they wanted to test out emulating community works in a browser and then supplementing it with oral history work. And my site champion at this third site was a digital collections archivist. And these sites and the champions will come up a little bit later. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Let's talk about how are we doing on time? How much
You are
time do I
good.
have?
You are good. Don't worry.
Okay, all right. Good. Let me get some water. All right. So if you read the abstract for this talk, I'm kind of interested in what I'm calling emulation encounters, these moments where people encounter emulation, either because it's part of their everyday work, or because they're visiting the special collection or the museum, or because they think they want to access an archival material or thing, right? So I'm trying to capture a bunch of different emulation encounters and think through how software is either being preserved as a utility or how it might be being preserved as an experience or an access point, and how those access points are being surfaced to users in new and different ways. For example, how much of an emulator should actually be known or communicated to the intended user if you're in a archival reading room context versus if you're at a touch museum and you're working with kids, right? How much those different kinds of use cases does the patron need to know an emulating experience is happening? And then when is it important that they know they're encountering a perfect preservation copy? And when is it important that they just are having an experience with an older or obsolete technology? So as I show in later parts, I hope, these descriptions or these questions really surface the ways in which we understand these access points, and then also whether or not the preservationists and interventions are visible or invisible. And that's sort of important if we think about how these workflows one day will become part of the professional best practices for providing access to software through emulation. So for each of these emulation encounters, I'm going to try to discuss how the access point is experienced, what kind of visions of access are being enacted, and then how we understand or see the preservationist, the emulator, and the user. Okay, that's sort of assemblage. Okay, so hopefully I'll get through this pretty quickly, but they're pretty fun. So one of the first things that I found very fun was looking at the exhibition displays at the Museum of Technology. And one of the challenges that preservationists who use emulators in exhibitions and display that they all face is how to raise awareness that an emulator is operating or that it even is existing when someone comes and experiences that artifact. And all three sites that I visited had some kind of exhibition display. It was usually interactive. It usually involved like getting you to sit down in front of something, encouraging patrons to really touch and engage with hardware. So the idea here is that you're interacting with software through a computing terminal. Exhibition designers, curators, and docents frequently talk to me about whether or not users should be made aware of those emulators present in the exhibit, and then what sorts of trips or things, hiccups have to happen in order for an emulator to sort of reveal itself. So given how much an emulator can sort of constrain or frame or guide the intended experience of the emulation that you're encountering. So I witnessed this a lot with this one particular game that was actually at all three sites, and that was the Oregon Trail game. So on the floor of the Museum of Technology, there's a couple of the different exhibits of Apple IIe machines, and they mostly had video games and educational software for visitors to use. And docents reported that the most popular game for a while was the Oregon Trail game. And you know, it's a game that was first released in the 1970s, but most people know the version from the 1980s or the 1990s. So if you grew up with a computer lab in your grammar school, you probably played this game if you had access to a computer lab. The game is like a super nostalgic favorite, and everyone always talks about it because of its like scatological references of like I died of dysentery. But what's important to remember here is that the most popular versions of the Oregon Trail game were released with 2 volumes. They came on 2 discs. And when players get halfway to Oregon through their journey, they have to switch the disc. So you have to know that the game is on a disc. You have to know that you have to eject it, right, and pull out the medium and put in a new floppy disk. So you have to actually know a couple of different orders of operations in order to be able to do that. And one common thing that the Museum of Technology and a couple of other places did as well is they would have preservation copies, but even the preservation copies would wear out. And so emulating it made a lot more sense. And so in this case, in this picture, there's a floppy emu disk emulator. So, so visitors could use the Apple IIe, they could play the game, and they wouldn't be wearing out the disk drive or another preservation copy on a floppy disk. In a floppy emu hard disk and floppy disk emulator, it uses SD memory cards to emulate software for Macs, for Lisa and Apple II computers. And it's used by a lot of Apple enthusiasts and digital preservationists because it can also emulate an Apple hard drive to transfer files in from the operating system. So during one day of the exhibitions, I got to see a visitor kind of playing with the game, and she finished the first half of the game. And then she kind of looked around and was like, there's no disk. Like, it says change the disk, and there's no disk. And you know, what's here and what I write about in the piece that this research is going to appear in is that the floppy emu disk emulator is sort of connected to the back of the Apple IIe with this sort of thick ribbon of wires. You can see it's pulled out here in this photo. And it has a little display screen that reads eject the disk. And all you have to do is change the disk on the emulator, right? But if you're not aware that the disk drive is being emulated, or that the little floppy emulator is tucked behind the Apple IIe, then you don't know how to commence to disk 2. So what's really interesting is when people are playing some of these games, folks like me and older typically know there's another disk around, there's a disk player around. But younger folks who are interacting with some of these hardware machines did not really have a good grasp of the external media of the floppy disk. So the visitor that I spoke to kind of knew there is another disk and you're supposed to eject it, but she didn't know how or where it was. And many of the interviewees that I talked to did at some point talk about these generational experiences with digital data storage, especially with disk drive, like mounting media formats, whether that's tape or inserting and ejecting tape disks properly. But this like eject the disk encounter with the floppy disk emulator sort of illustrates this like tension between providing access to hardware in the game and the software title, and the possibilities of a real complete emulation experience, you know, like of actually finishing the game, right? In this case, the floppy disk emulator in some ways kind of constrains your ability to continue the emulation if you don't know how disk storage works or why you might emulate the disk. So I think that kind of shows something kind of interesting. In other hardware exhibits and disk emulators that I observed at each of the sites often did this, where they were sort of literally hidden from view and not totally explained by exhibition materials or display cards. And it's not necessarily true that users even notice once they reached the endpoint. So not everyone got to the middle of Oregon Trail, you know. But the patron's sort of confusion about where and how the missing disk could be ejected reveals sort of this really vexing constraint that docents and preservationists who are curating exhibitions have to face. On the one hand, we can provide a perfect emulation experience with the first disk, but which obviates the need for lots of preservation copies and wearing out the disk drive, for example. But it doesn't give us that easy access to the second disk, which is the complete game experience. And so only using the hardware and sort of hiding the disk emulator may inhibit users' encounter, right? And then also sort of keep them from knowing more about how disk drives, media formats, and the limits of storage in older operating systems might exist. So in this vision of access during exhibition and display, the priority of experience is about using the hardware, using the machine, instead of mounting the disks, for example, or understanding a work on 2 different volumes. And that's sort of important to think about. Here's another encounter. As I said this earlier, one of the sites, the Vintage Computing Lab, had done a number of community-driven documentation strategies early on to talk to their community about what kinds of stories and collections they wanted. And because it's an engineering and technical school, the students themselves said we want access to machines that we've used and games or software that we've created ourselves. And so one of the interesting things at all three sites is the preservationists would come up with all these really interesting ways to communicate why and what they were preserving in terms of framing the intended community or the community stakes. And I got to see a couple of really cool different documentation strategies, but one in particular was these kind of brief, what they called software stories, which were brief oral history interviews of games that they were emulating. So the background is almost everyone that goes to this engineering school learns the programming language C by creating a Game Boy game. And they can be played in lots of different ways, but they decided to preserve and store them, and you can go and play them on this EverDrive cart disk. But they also started collecting these brief oral history interviews to talk about why and how. So let's watch this really quickly. Oops. Let's watch this oral history interview. It's about a minute and a half.
It's Monday, March 11th, and we're in the archives reading room, and I'm interviewing Ariana on her 2261 final project. So what's your last name? What's your full name? Sorry. It's okay. It's fine. I can keep going.
Okay, let's go. Okay. Hello, I'm Ariana Patamavong. I'm a third year here at Georgia Tech, and I'm a computational media major.
Okay, and then what was the name of your game, and can you give us a brief description of it?
So the game that I created for my CS class was Cooking While a Food Fight. I was inspired by the Neopets ice cream game where you have to dodge the items, but in this case, you just like collect them and stuff, and then there's like effects if you get hit by them, your lives will go down, things like that. Very simple.
Okay, yeah, sure. And what was your inspiration behind it?
That was the Neopets ice cream game that I mentioned. It's something I played a lot as a kid on the computer.
Okay,
So I was like,
yes.
I want to do this.
And then tell me about one memory that you have of using technology as a kid that made you want to do CM in college.
Oh dang, hold on. Let me think on this question. I don't know, I played like on my Nintendo DS a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
And just things like, was it the Super Mario Bros. Game? That was always really cool. And just in general, like graphic design and stuff I was always interested in. And so that's what made me really want to switch it to CM because it allows to be more creative than CS instead of just straight coding, things like that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop it a little bit early to keep with our time. But what I love about that oral history is that the subject's cell phone goes off in the middle of the interview. And also that the interviewee, the archivist asks, tell us a memory that made you want to be where you are today and design these kind of works. And what I really love about that is that it shows us why we're emulating it. And then it's also asking what inspired the people to create this work in sort of a longer, broader way. And also it does it in about 2 minutes. It's a pretty interesting thing. So what was really cool about this oral history software story exhibit is they were able to share it with other classes of students, and a lot more people deposited their games, but it also got people excited about sort of collecting and being a part of this retro collection. It's really cool. Anyway, I thought like that layer of oral history for emulation is pretty unique, and I hadn't seen it anywhere else. Okay, so let's talk about another emulation encounter. Another really big challenge for preservationists in developing software preservation workflows is actually emulating the action and functionality of peripheral hardware in contemporary contexts like a browser computer or a keyboard. And this is particularly true of really unique controllers of early gaming systems and home consoles. And this was really clear in a couple different field sites where collections of video games and consoles are a big part of their collection. Both sites, the Museum of Technology and the Vintage Computing Lab, have what Laurie Emerson calls a hands-on imperative for visitors. So when people come into these spaces, they're really asked to use, to play, to physically experience these hardware collections as if they had access to them in earlier times. And in nearly all of my interviews with preservationists, when I asked them about their favorite machines and emulated software, many of them talked about their favorite emulators being able to control like paddles or laser guns or different kinds of controllers on consoles that we no longer have access to. Many of the interviewees who reported on their favorite game emulators talked about the challenge for mapping unique controllers to gaming systems and then understanding the utility or the ways in which you use a laser paddle on a keyboard, for example. So mapping is necessary to emulate peripheral controllers with keywords, and each button has to be pressed and each input and each triggered action has to be basically mapped, okay? Even the axis of a joystick has to be mapped onto a keyboard. And what that ultimately means is more popular games get mapped and more popular game consoles are more likely to be mapped in hobbyist emulators than rare games or trying to remember what they're called, game hacks, personalized games, and then also rare consoles in particular. And so I learned that mapping controllers is like really, really slow work. And for circulating collections where we want people to come in and play those game consoles, not necessarily the emulated versions, where collections are accessible to the public, then the archivists or the preservationists have to like have shared time. They have to build that into their workflow. Because mapping controllers take so long, you end up taking the item off the floor and you risk not having everyday users being able to play with those things. Most of the software preservation workflows that I observed assume a lot of time is going to be spent building and preparing the emulation, but mapping controllers for consoles involves spending even more time with specific game titles. And so one of the issues is whether or not you're familiar with that game or whether or not you're familiar with that game console. And preservationists are less likely to have time to learn a Game Boy DS, for example, if you've never played it before. So mapping those controllers and understanding those triggering activities is really slow work if you're not actually used to the game consoles and you didn't use it sort of when you were growing up or playing it before. Prioritizing the user's physically accessing materials is called a preservation through use model. The idea here is that the more people use it, the more we want to preserve it. But it also means that preservationists who are interested in emulating, right, doing these mapping controllers, they have to plan to coordinate the collections circulating around in advance. And they also have to make a lot of time to play the title and use controllers or to do research like watch videos of how to beat the game. In this access model of preservation through use, we prioritize users physically accessing materials and guiding the selection of more popular titles generally. Okay. I think this is one of my last two. So framing talk. This is a screen grab of an emulator running an older version of OS 9 and an architectural software program that renders AutoCAD drawings called Vectorworks. And on the far left bar, we see that this is the emulation. This is like a virtual environment, right? This is OS 9. This is the software running the AutoCAD drawing. And I want to draw your attention to these folders over here on the far right. If we look at that frame, those folders, those are folders that the archivists have created, and they're what we would think of as a folder series for researchers to open and run through using the emulating environment. But the problem is that these folders and this experience has already been pre-packaged and curated, and it's actually been prepared twice. It's been extracted from the historical subjects collections machine, and then it's been wrapped up again in these folder series for someone to access. So how do we explain to researchers interested in looking at historic plans from a particular subject, like a famous architect, that these plans are available to look at through emulation, but they're not in the particular order and not necessarily in the particular description, or even in the original file, right, of the archival collection that the special collection has taken in. For a lot of interviewees across sites, emulation was understood as a risk And making this emulation known will also meant that we might be overburdening the users with too much information about the technical processes sort of happening under the hood. So one of the questions is, how much do they need to know about building this virtual environment in order to run the emulator? How much do they need to know about the structure of these documents that are available to access in the emulation? And how much do they just need to know about this one architectural plan, for example? So they sort of talked about these visibility and invisible interventions in terms of how the preservationists would be seen, instead of thinking about shaping the access points, which is also kind of interesting. At some point, almost all the interviewees mentioned the potential magic of emulation, like a one-click getting to go magic experience of just suddenly having an emulated environment pull up from, like, for example, a catalog record. And for many of the preservationists, this language of software integration and purposely backgrounding the emulator is used to imagine an ideal access experience where things just automatically work. And in these idealized visions of seamlessly like getting to the starting point of opening up that historic document, for example, a user is able to just simply click on something without having to learn too much about how emulation actually works, or how the original software may have been featured into that computing history in that moment in time. So while documentation and visual cues were often assumed and sometimes discussed, most interviewees wanted to cut back on these scaffolding processes that sort of bolstered description, or these frames within frames, in order to get people to that historic experience. So they wanted to do this eliding of the emulation process itself. There was this other way of describing it too, was also going through save states. So developing these sort of ideal best paths for people to go through to find the most important documents that everyone would go through. And there might be a way of documenting that chain of actions. These were called save states or desired paths. And it assumed that, like, most people who are visiting a special collection want to go to these kinds, for example, the oldest correspondence, or the most famous documents, the most famous manuscripts. So ideally, you could develop a set of canned save states for people to sort of go through these common paths, these garden paths, and then document that chain. In both scenarios, save state and automagic, they want to sort of think about hailing the emulator in different ways. So the way you encountered it and where you begin at the beginning is sort of different. But in each example, the user of these ideal use cases would engage with layers of emulation through the descriptive record, which is sort of interesting to think about it. How we're describing how people would actually find the emulator experience if they're looking for a collection. Few of the people that I talked to expressed concerns about hiding these layers from users, both as an intervention or as a process. Not very many people were worried that this could inhibit users' understandings of what's actually happening. Instead, they imagined hailing, hailing the emulator and building the environment for users as a real advance, and it would make things a lot easier. For some teams that I talked to and observed, software is not an actual active collecting area in their institution. And so emulation workflows are still just being imagined, just being formulated, just being tested, just being staged. And many of them have very slow periodic successes. And until recently, software for most libraries, archives, and museums has just been passively collected as part of acquiring special collections or faculty papers or public research projects, or they gather shrink wrap media, for example. But for information institutions, that had emulation initiatives, they were really trying to support ambitious new scientific data management plans in a lot of cases. But most of the preservationists working in teams that I interviewed and observed, there were few robust existing cases of emulation where they could draw upon sort of empirical user data to support description and access points and make the case to their administrators to support these programs. So for example, it's still very early days. We don't know how to describe emulation or emulator experiences in catalog records. There's not a formal way of doing it in exhibition displays, for example, with art, or even in finding aids with special collections. So they had to draw on their own previous experiences with either existing research projects or their professional knowledge about anticipating future use cases or using new technologies. In many of my interviews where participants mapped the workflows, they would draw or explain these sort of circuitous dead ends or failures, necessary failures. So for research and design and testing emulators, until a reliable emulation process could be integrated, there's a lot of failure over and over and over again. And so one interviewee here maps out "here be dragons," okay, which is, I think, a good metaphor for thinking about we're in very early days of these workflows and relying on them as access points. Here's where I think software curation takes a role in implementing experiences of use and areas of collection emphasis. And I still think we need more research into how curation decisions confront failures, those dragons or unknown lilting experiments. But understanding how failure and experimentation is a part of a robust emulation workflow is, I think, really important. So we need to start thinking about not only how to build in failure into those ideal workflows and assume that they're going to happen, we also need to think about how we're going to be describing these emulation workflows as new things. So what are some special considerations that we might think about for discovery, for use in catalogs or in library databases or in search engines? I think that's like, we're still pretty, we're on the precipice of seeing that, but those robust scenarios where we could describe emulation counters would, I don't know, begin to signal and drive more programmatic support from stakeholders and organizational leadership for emulation as an access service provision in institutions. So this is a really long way of saying all these failures in emulation projects make it hard to make the case to administrators to pay for sustaining this important early work. So researchers like us need to start thinking about how we normalize it or build it into our normative descriptions of access. Okay, so let me get to the end here. That was like a crazy round the world tour of a lot of different kinds of emulation encounters and practices. But I want you to think about how at the top of the talk, I asked you to remember a kind of software experience from the past that you would want to access again. If you think about that kind of experience that you want, I would like to encourage you to push you. How could it fit or not fit into oral histories, into a hardware display, into description, into a catalog record? How would you make that more visible? It's really, really complicated to think about, like, sort of when the experience of emulation happens. I think we can see it in a lot of the fieldwork and the complexities of the organizational workflows that I talked about, but we're still in early stages. So I think, like, thinking about more of this when is really important. Okay, so that ends my presentation. But before I move to Q&A, I want to take a moment and acknowledge the funders and collaborators. This research would not have been possible without them. I also want to thank all the participants in the research cohort. This work is not possible without them too, so I really appreciate it. I'm really grateful to all these important collaborators. So if you're interested in finding out more about this project, you can check out my website, or you can go to the Software Preservation Network website. We created some open educational resources to teach some of these ideas about emulation in place and some of the issues that practitioners face. So if you want to teach those in your classes, they're available. So thank you so much.
That was awesome. Thank you, Amelia. So one of the things as, you asked that question and just thinking about just how quickly it seems that technology has really shifted. I remember, working in TV starting in 1991, and everything was, like with editing and tapes and going from 2-inch to 1-inch to 3/4 inch. And then in 94, I started using our first nonlinear editing system, the iMix Video Cube. And that transition, just thinking too about if there were emulations too, and how there were these moments that things had to be familiar going from like the analog into this digital realm. And so I don't know, just seeing all of this and thinking about it, and it's like so much is about the body and what we're doing with it. So I love the idea of the preservation through use, and seeing emulation as a trial and error sort of, you know, progression, and not just here it is, but really the playfulness of it. So thank you for your talk. And if anybody else has any questions or anything, please dive right in, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. I just go off on that for a second. The embodiment layer is really, really important. And I think anyone who's ever used T9 on their cell phone can remember this, but there are these certain things where if you have the hardware in your hand, you can figure it out. But if you were asked to describe it, or if you were asked to write a manual for someone else to do it in another time and place, it would be very hard. So this work is like really embodied. And then you also need to have experiences up over time, right? That lifetime of runtimes to do that failure and understand and build that knowledge. So I think it's really important, and it's sort of still understudied. I'd like to talk more about it too. Any other questions or reactions? You could just say stuff.
I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Hey, Amelia, how's it going?
Hey, Zach.
Thanks for a great talk. I have a lot of questions for you, but just going to you talked about member checks, and
yeah.
I was curious about points where you maybe had disagreements with your participants, and places where you saw things that the participants couldn't see or couldn't articulate because maybe they were so embodied and sort of forms of tacit knowledge. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, very happy to talk about that. So member checks for grad students on the call or who don't know about this, member checks is where when you're studying a community of practice, you want to be able to go back and say, hey, is this right? Did I get this right? Do you think this is right? And so one of the things is I wrote up this sort of white paper report and shared it with the larger cohort group. And I got some good feedback. One, I didn't talk about hobbyist communities at all. So one of the things that they really honed in on was that my story of emulation begins with archivists and software preservationists in the 1990s, when really it goes back to like synthesizers and much earlier in time, computing history, hobbyist communities. And so making that frame or starting point known, like I'm really interested in information professionals where this is part of their day-to-day work, was helpful. Another interesting thing was I was sort of like, oh, well, these are all the people that are responsible for communicating what emulation is or for using it in their day-to-day work. And particularly in the art institutions, the art museums, for example, they were like, oh, well, there's all these people, the art handlers, the lighting technicians, the museum scientists, who frame the experience of coming up to the work that you've completely left out here. And so one challenge that I've had is like, how are you talking about like something that's happening on the screen versus these very rich encounters that are happening like in a space, you know? And like that I think is really cool. Another interesting thing is like almost all of the practitioners had these like big kind of like, I don't know what you would call it, like the bridge in Star Trek. Like they all had like 360 degrees of things of computing machines around them. And so I found that very interesting. They kind of had swivel chairs and moved a lot. But yeah, I'm still getting feedback, and I'm still like, there's some stuff that I haven't been able to, that I'm still learning how to talk about. But the biggest one is that, and this is important to talk about in this moment in times of precarity, is almost every one of the groups that I talked about had a leadership change at the administrative level. The university librarian is leaving, board members change, that sort of trickle down and impact workflow in these kind of weird and different ways that you would never really imagine. But if there's organizational change happening at the top, these kind of things on the edge are always at risk. So that was another big thing that I haven't really published about, but it's important to talk about, like in hierarchical organizations like libraries, the leadership at the top can really make a sea change. Thank you for the question, Zach.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, I feel I'm interloping today. Such is the wonder of being virtual, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you're able to join.
It's been really fun hearing about your research. I have a few just process items and interests too. I was really interested in just hearing about, let's see, so I know that where to start. What was something very surprising from one of your sites that you're still working through?
Oh, yeah. So one thing that I'm still trying to talk about is, Jamie kind of mentioned this before, is like the knowledge that you have from being exposed to computers or software based on your age or like when you started your first job, versus the knowledge that you might pick up as a new or early career professional. So for example, like I know what OS 9 looks like. So if the beach ball keeps going for 15 minutes, I know that the emulator environment is crashing. But if the beach ball isn't something that you're familiar with from another generation, and you haven't seen a OS 9 crash on you, then you're kind of stuck and you don't know, is the emulator not working? Is the machine not working? Did I mount the wrong? You know, there's a couple of these things where, which is not really in the documentation. People don't read documentation that closely. So unless you've picked up on that experiential knowledge. So talking about people's age and that sort of tacit information or experience that you pick up about information technologies and that failure is kind of interesting. There were all these moments, it triggers like all these memories. So like we would mount like CD-ROM games, or they'd pull out these old consoles, and it just like, it's suddenly a very evocative experience. And that's something that I think as a researcher we don't get to talk about enough. But it was like, just like when they talk about like, oh, I gasped in the reading room because I saw this document. It was just like that, but different.
So was that a process for you of navigating, you know, what you wanted, what was your message of the research, from one of this is great kind of personally edifying information, but also now I want to feed it into my teaching that I do. So was that a shift for you?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't written about like that aha moment or that like the physical memory, but I have talked about it in my teaching, where you kind of have a responsibility, or you have to go and get you have to gather more knowledge about some of the stuff that you may be encountering for the first time, that you may not be familiar with for whatever reason. And then also it behooves us to read a little bit about how, like I've been reading Agree's like how to teach someone how to use a computer, and it's from the 90s, but kind of going back and thinking about how to teach computing from 20 years ago is like a really good way of kind of getting into the zone, or thinking about the different layers of this stack. It's very just different from the way we use our operating systems today.
Yeah, that was one thing, like when I taught digital storytelling and culture, and even asking the students, how do you tell the story of like accessing your first Word document, or how do you get in there? And they're like, well, I go to. I'm like, well, what does go to mean? And they're like, oh, thinking of like, how do you move the mouse? Like all of these little things that we, you know, sum up in just going to something. I just click on this, like, well, what's clicking? It's just interesting to think about those things that have just, you know, become embodied.
Yeah, totally.
Any other questions or comments?
I have another quick question for you, Amelia. Did your participants look to the future at all and thinking about how they could plan for future preservation or emulation activities around some of these new things like download only software or apps and mobile software?
Yeah, so we occasionally talked about like the future where there might not be like stuff to donate, or it'll just be like a bunch of cell phones or something. But actually, this is kind of a funny, peculiar moment where like there's actually a ton of stuff that we have to collect from the 90s and early 2000s. So thinking about stuff from the now, I did have one funny conversation about collecting like off-brand MP3 players. So like there are these certain emulation experiences that may be very hard, right? Like I know a lot about Napster, but we can't emulate Napster without breaking the law now. So someone has to create some monopoly money MP3s in order for us to actually have that experience, right? So there are a couple of these fun, weird ones that I did have these kind of rambling, fun conversations, but there's still so much stuff from the, I don't know, recent past that I think there was more of a focus on that. Yeah.
Is LimeWire still a thing?
I don't know. Is LimeWire still a thing, kids?
Or Kazaa? Was there a Kazaa as well?
Oh, yeah. Let me see. Maybe there is. There were kind of these funny things where you're like, these early networking experiences that we file transfer stuff that, you know, just might not be possible. Or like, how would you save that? Anyway, but yeah, peer-to-peer file sharing is like, I'd love to talk more about that.
Sarah?
Well,
it's just fascinating that to think about this broader dimension of your work with the software preservation network. And it really feels like the cohort experience brought this huge dimension to the insights that you're sharing. And just, you know, it's so great being able to have a cohort. So what's next for the, I won't say the SPN itself, but maybe what's next for wherever you want to go next?
So the software preservation network is starting a new project or a new one of these kind of long-term 2-year projects where they're kind of testing emulation as a service. And I mentioned this platform, but they're kind of testing this emulation as a service infrastructure, maybe easy is how they call it. And I think it's through, Cindy's on the call, she would know more. But they are sort of their new project like this, and more people are going to be testing the platform with different new projects, and they're going to try and bring in more institutions. One of the things that I kind of want to think about is like staying away, being platform agnostic, right? So I want to study new teams working with emulation or emulators that aren't necessarily testing the easy platform. But I want to continue to follow that work a lot. And their documentation is really, it's just like jump leaps and bounds. So like keep an eye out for the ways in which they're going to start implementing description. Metadata, I think, is a new big thing, the way that they talk about what's happening in the emulator. One thing that I want to encourage other people to do is like, so this is the Software Preservation Network is like a cohort of volunteer. I think they pay in a little bit, but it's like it's a volunteer organization, and hooking into these sorts of practitioner networks has been really fruitful for me as a researcher. And it just was like total happenstance that they were like, we're doing a 2-year project and we need a researcher to study workflows. And I was like, I'm doing that, I'm in. So it was a competitive application and I applied. But like trying to find these communities to work with has been really enriching. And it also like keeps you grounded in terms of getting more data for your students. I think that that's been a really good, important part about this that I didn't really report that much about, but it's been really great as an educator too. So Sarah says here that the Yale is driving it, and more nodes are coming from Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, and others. And I can't help but not say it, like most of these partners are private Ivies or like private schools that have a lot of resources. And so I think it's worth keeping an eye on how things turn out. But I'm really interested in looking at smaller, mid-size, or publicly funded institutions and how they're doing it, because it may be that we all end up emulating and providing access this way, but it could be different. So capturing these different stories, I think, is important too.
Any other questions or comments for Amelia?
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks for the great talk, Amelia. You mentioned like failures in the workflows for emulation, and then also kind of the running down of the material hardware. And I was wondering, speaking of the beach ball, if anyone brought up kind of issues of like software failure, because at least personally, so much of my time with software in the 2000s, with like imaging software, music software, there was so much, I guess now we'd think of it as kind of like tremendous waste of time and of, you know, like saving and just a lot of kind of errors generally that now are kind of like not optimal. You know, they're try to iron them out completely. So that I think is part of the experience, but I was wondering if the emulators were kind of thought of in that way at all.
Yeah, totally. So like we talked a little bit about that detective work of like, what is the mystery happening here? And is it a corrupted disk image? Is there something wrong with the virtual environment? Is there something wrong with the machine itself? Like which layer, where is the failure happening is like part of the diagnostic situation that people have to do, and they're like figuring out what's going on and what's going wrong. But yeah, there was a lot of software failure and then having to confirm it. But another layer that's going on top is the digital rights management. So most of these folks can't go and get other copies or make copies unless they own the title in their collection. So there's also these like legal constraints around making sure that the copy that you have is reliable and that you can copy it yourself freely and legally. I talked about this a little bit with mapping controllers, but this is going to be a big issue for what archivists call appraisal, is that eventually we'll just emulate the software that was the most popular or the software that was the most meaningful for the Mars Explorer, but we won't emulate all the software for filling out timesheets or copying mixed CDs. Like, we'll only sample a few of them because of how resource intensive it is. And it'll be really interesting to see who makes those decisions and why, right? And so Oregon Trail makes a lot of sense. Almost every American kid that had a PC in their computer lab at school had played Oregon Trail. So that makes a lot of sense for us to emulate everywhere. But Vectorworks, the AutoCAD thing for a few architectural professors in a few places in the country, who knows, right? But the cool thing about this emulation as a service infrastructure is that it's a sort of a platform that everyone could dial into. So if we build that environment and we build it for Vectorworks, then anyone can dial in and reuse that sort of save state or that path. So I think it'll be interesting. Like, what's the software we're going to save and want to emulate? What are those experiences that we do want to have again? And then what are the ones that we'll just have some screen grabs of and we'll save the, you know, the manuals, for example. That's another thing that I learned is like not everything needs to be emulated as an experience. So.
Anything else for Amelia? All right, well, thank you. A hearty Wildcat thank you from Tucson, Arizona.
Thank you so much. It's so great seeing and hearing all of you guys. And I hope that we get to see each other in person in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and when is your publication out?
So I have a paper in the ACES proceedings that just came out. And if you want a copy of that, you can email me. I should have an open access version on my website in a couple of weeks. And then I have a couple other papers under review.
All right.
Cross your fingers. Hopefully they'll come out in the next year or so. But
well,
yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you so much. And like, I've learned so much in these like 90 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. You guys take care and stay safe.
You too.
Thanks, Amelia.
Thank you.